The next speaker presentation is a little longer than we had designed, so he's asking that any questions, write them down, and you can ask them at the forum later tonight. Because we plan to have, after all this is done, go to dinner, come back, have a forum, some entertainment, like I said before, a lot of fun. One of the reasons I started this is to get all these open-minded people in one spot. That is something that for you personally, and I'm sure a lot of you truly, truly enjoy, where you can have the interaction with the same mindset. Certainly not the same theories, but the same mindset. Okay, the next speaker is kind of one of the reasons I started this also. There was a conference in Fort Wayne a couple years ago where it had many, many speakers. Wayne May was here, and the next speaker was here, and we just kind of hit it off talking about, I have a home in the Philippines, and he's always dreamed of seeing these rice terraces in the Philippines. And he has some great theories on these rice terraces in the Philippines. So he really helped me kind of get this thing going on, helped me contact some different people, and that's kind of how this come about. So I'm very thankful for that. Frank Joseph has written nearly 36 books. One of, I gotta believe, one of the most prolific research authors there is. You'll see a lot of his material out there. I'm sure you can't bring all of it here. Car isn't big enough. But Frank has written a new book, should be available like almost immediately. I think it just got finished. I think he was finishing on his drive down here, actually. But it's something different of a new theory on Frank has come up with, and I know a little bit about it, but that's what this presentation is. And so I'm going to introduce the next speaker, Frank Joseph.
I'm not going to talk about theories too much. You know, opinions, everybody has one, so mine is a little more valuable than anybody else. What I want to talk to you about today is a site which is not too well known to the outside world. We're all familiar with the Great Pyramid and Stonehenge and the Great Wall of China. But and I'm not familiar with this right now.
We didn't have the light last time. Green card.
Is that all right? Doesn't look too ridiculous. Yeah, we're all familiar with the Great Wall of China and Stonehenge and all these wonderful places around the world, but there is a site which is at least as great as these, and not at all as well known. And it is as far away from us right now as a place you can imagine. It's on the other side of the world in the Southeast Pacific. It's in the middle of Micronesia. The nearest landfall is nearly 3,000 miles away. It's a very small island. It's called Panap. Some say Ponape. And on this island, there are only a few thousand inhabitants, Micronesians, rather primitive people, live in almost squalid conditions. It's not a place you'd want to visit. There's no Club Med there. And just due north of Panap, literally canoes ride away, there is truly one of the great wonders of the ancient world. It's known as Nan Madol. And Nan Madol, N-A-N-M-A-D-O-L, is the Micronesian name for this place, which otherwise is nameless. It means the spaces in between. The name Panap or Ponape means built upon an altar. And the traditions of the Micronesian people about this place are very sparse, although enlightening. The only way I can begin to describe Nan Madol is give you some specifics about it. It is a kind of a city, if you can call it that, the remains of a city, that is made up entirely of magnetized basalt. The basalt, of course, is a volcanic extrusion. This basalt is remarkable for a couple of reasons. Not only is it all magnetized, The city, which is spread, or I use that term very loosely, city, is spread over 170 acres and is made up of 250 million tons of magnetized basalt. And all this magnetized basalt has been crafted into girders and columns that range from 3 feet long to 25 feet long. That the city is made up of 92 islets. Again, I use that term loosely. They don't know what else to call it. Square formations, canals. It's surrounded by a wall almost a half a mile long. The largest stone is 60 tons. It is not a stone that is just in situ. It was actually lifted upon another stone in ancient times. Let's travel with more technology here, but I'll get that out later. Non-Madol first came to the attention of the outside world fairly recently, in the 19th century, when some sailors happened to visit Ponape. And the walls are still intact for the most part of this place. The walls were abutted by towers reaching perhaps 40 feet high. The average girders, which are between 3 and 25 feet long, the largest one's about 25 feet long, were hoisted into the air to about 35, 40 feet to make these towers. This is quite an achievement for pre-industrial people, whoever they were, without beasts of burden or with the wheel. The islets are all connected by corridors and by tunnels. One of the tunnels is half a mile long, and remarkably, at least one of the tunnels goes underwater to a chamber 15 feet below the surface of the water, a dry air chamber. The first real study of non-Madol was not really conducted until the 1970s. A fellow by the name of Arthur Sachs at the University of Oregon. He's the first one that really made a detailed scientific survey with his students over the years. And they were trying to determine how old this place was. Carbon dating came in the 1950s. In the 1970s, it improved somewhat. However, there's very little carbon datable material at non-Madol because it's a tropical climate. Organic material disappears very quickly. The only thing they found was the residue of a turtle feast that somebody had at non-Madol, and they were able to backdate that to about 2,000 years ago. It proved absolutely nothing. It just proved that somebody cooked a turtle at non-Madol 2,000 years ago. It doesn't show when it was made. The place is obviously incredibly old, though. We do have an idea now, thanks to Dr. Sachs, of how old this place is. Now, non-Madol, the description of it, the longer you get into a description of it, the more incredible it becomes. This collection of 250 million tons of magnetized basalt was actually made in the water on a coral reef. It sits in the water on a coral reef. It has streets, but no burials whatsoever. No sign of any burials, any coffins, nothing of that type. There are some glyphs, however, that have been found, thanks to Dr. Sachs, on the walls of non-Madol. And the glyphs are few, and they appear to be numerical notations, not part of a written language. There's a cross, a square, a rectangle, and an open rectangle, which are repeated at certain junctures. The indication is that these are numerical notations of some kind. The people that live on Ponape today, or Ponape, know nothing about these notations. When Dr. Sachs and his team did a survey of non-Madol, they also went into the water. They had a scuba diving team. And they were amazed to see that the ruins of non-Madol extend from the surface, along the side of the coral reef, and deep under the sea. They found a number, dozens of these hewn columns out of magnetized basalt, some as long as almost 30 feet, laying in the water. So it was presumed, well, these magnetized basalt must have been dropped over time, fallen overboard. But that turned out to be not the case, because quite a number of these columns have been found at depths of 100 feet, directly almost underneath the non-metal structure, standing upright, and in rows as well. So that indicates that there must have been construction at non-metal when the ocean levels were 100 feet lower than they are today. Non-metal is like no other place in the world. Well, there are two other sites that seem similar to it, but really like no other place in the world. The columns are roughly hewn out, as though someone was in a hurry. And they are stacked up in a Lincoln log-like structure. No cement, no plaster involved, no decoration, nothing that really indicates homes or baths or anything like that. Very unusual place. The largest tower today that still survives is called Nandawas, and that stands almost 20 feet tall. But Dr. Sachs and other archaeologists since then have been able to recreate that there were these towers that are almost as high as 40 feet. The reason why they have fallen, most of the city is intact, but ruinous, is not because it was ever sacked or attacked by somebody, but because of earthquake activity, naturally, and also because of the jungle growth, which is dismantling the entire non-metal structure right now. The corridors and tunnels are finely crafted and connect literally all of these so-called islets. The two other sites that this sort of fingerprint architecture is found at is at another island called Kosrae, which is 300 miles due west of Non-Madol or Panang. It's much smaller, but it's the same technique. It's far more ruinous, again because of earthquake activity mostly. And the islanders there, also Micronesians, know nothing about it, lay no claim to its manufacture. And the other site, where you do find something like Non-Madol, actually quite similar, using magnetized basalt, set up in a kind of a Lincoln log type structure, is in western Mexico, at one site in Oaxaca. And this site is totally unique in Mesoamerica. It's not particularly large, and it's associated with the Olmec culture. The Olmec are the earliest known civilizers in North America. Nothing else known about that except in these three places, interestingly enough. It's very difficult to draw any kind of conclusions about Non-Madol. But what I find particularly fascinating about it, I've never been there, and I feel kind of hesitant to talk about a place I've never visited. It's very expensive to go there, and I don't have the wherewithal to see, so I have to depend on other sources for that. The best source for knowing about Non-Madol is a rather dry report, but you can get it for free from the interlibrary loan system, and that is from the University of Oregon. All you have to do is request the papers of Dr. Arthur Sachs. What I've tried to do in my book, I wrote a book called The Lost Civilization of Lemuria. I have distilled his research into its most salient points, I hope, and tried to present them there. Not expanded on anything, I've not enlarged anything. How can you enlarge on a place which is already so large in every sense of the word? But what I found particularly fascinating about Non-Madol is that here is a building which talks not only about the ancient past, but also about the future, about our future, and really about our immediate future and what's going on now. And I will try to bring that together. That's why I think it's incredibly cogent about Non-Madol. And Non-Madol being made out of magnetized basalt, its weirdness doesn't end there. Because the first archaeological team that did real serious work that preceded Dr. Sachs was from Japan. And I didn't mention them at first because all of their records have been lost. The Japanese took an interest in Non-Madol back in the 1930s. And they sent an archaeological team. They actually were doing archaeological work all throughout Polynesia and through much of Southeast Asia. And the reason why they were doing that is because the Japanese government in those days was trying to create the co-prosperity sphere. Their vision in that time, in the 1930s, was to unite Asia into kind of a cooperative sphere because they were worried about the encroachment of Soviet communism into Asia, and they worried, also disliked Western capitalism. They wanted to keep Asia free from the encroachments of both capitalism and communism. And as a precursor for that, they wanted to show that there was some kind of archaeological basis for the unification of Asia. And the reason I bring that up is because archaeology is inextricable from politics, always has been. People like to make separation between the two, but it's impossible. And that's why some of the things that we're discussing here can really only be talked about in a public forum. And you cannot discuss them amongst at the academic community because you're considered a heretic and whatever you have to say is detrimental to the governing paradigm. That said, when the Japanese came to Panap and investigated Nanmadol, they did it very thoroughly. Total scientific team from the University of Tokyo. And they did surveys which they've all been lost. But the reason I mention them is because they made a tremendous discovery that was a tremendous military benefit to Japan. It played a major part of their war effort and also adds and deepens to the mystery of Nanmadol inextricably, because the Japanese found on Panap and at Nanmadol itself, at the city, tremendous quantities of platinum, which is impossible to find. There is no platinum, not a trace of it found anywhere throughout the Pacific. Nowhere else, except concentrated on Nanmadol. They found so much platinum at Nanmadol that they mined it. Now, platinum is extremely valuable today, as it was back in the 1930s, for electronic devices, especially the electronic devices that went into early radar. The only place, for example, that you can find quantities of platinum within the general area of Japan, and this is why Japan was interested in Burma, is in Burma. Burma also has large quantities of platinum, but nowhere else throughout the Pacific. How platinum got to be concentrated on this teeny speck of an island in the Pacific, no one knows. And to get back to the magnetized basalt, that's a problem too. 250 million tons of magnetized basalt were crafted. They weren't just there and accumulated, but actually crafted to make the city. Where is the source for the magnetized basalt? Well, on the other side of Panap itself, there is a quarry of basalt, naturally occurring basalt. And it's also magnetized basalt. It's the same type that's used to create Nanmadol. So archaeologists first assumed, Dr. Sachs assumed, well, this is their quarry. But when he brought his information back to the University of Oregon, his colleagues said, yes, this is a source for some of the magnetized basalt that went into the making of Nanmadol. But Nanmadol uses over 250 million tons of it, and that this quarry never had anything close to that amount. Where did this magnetized basalt come from? Then when you add that to the far lesser but still substantial magnetized basalt that's found on the adjacent island of Kosrae, the source for that magnetized basalt is a total mystery. No geologist can figure out where such huge quantities of magnetized basalt came from. The city is, again, I use the word city in a very quotable way, not in a direct way. The city of Nanmadol, although it's ruinous and it's made rather crudely, as though in a hurry, it has a tremendous elegance. And I'm going to try to show some of it here if I can. I have two, no, this is not it. This is not it. What I'm doing here. Here we are. This is Nanmadol today. You can see that the stonework, this is just one of the better preserved but smaller walls. This is all magnetized basalt. You see it's crudely quarried. However, there's tremendous regularity and elegance here. There are no astronomical orientations, as was once suspected. Nothing like that whatsoever. This particular wall will go on for about 3/4 of a mile. And now consider that this is all done, this is all deposition or growth on top of a coral reef. You only have to scratch below there and you're on the coral. And it's a mystery who built this place. Well, what do the natives say? Let's see if I can find this. Here's another view of part of a tower. There are windows, grand staircases, huge courtyards for ceremonial activity of some kind. When you look at other ruins throughout the Pacific, and there are numerous ancient ruins throughout the Pacific, and many are very impressive, none can hold a candle to this place. There's no real sign of domesticity going on here. The more you look at it, the more mysterious it becomes. As far as the statistics are concerned, let's say I can't even remember them all. There's so many. The nearest landfall is 2,300 miles away in Japan. Let's see if I can find this. Now, the natives of Panap, the Micronesian natives, they have very few traditions of this place. When asked who built it, they say a foreign people, two brothers began. They came from a place called Camaswale. It's one of the pronunciations, Camaswale. And Camaswale is described as a fabulous kingdom across the sea, where all these sorcerers lived. And Camaswale went under the sea in some kind of a disaster, and that these two brothers came and they created this place as a place of refuge. And they created it with a flying dragon. Now, it's possibly that the remembrance of a flying dragon is a less evolved people's way of saying that this is a technology which their ancestors couldn't grasp. There is a site that's related to Nanmadol that bears no physical resemblance to it whatsoever. That's over 2,000 miles away. This site, though, you may have heard of, if I can find it. Sorry. This is called Yonaguni. And Yonaguni is a small almond-shaped island off the coast of the Ryukyu Islands. Japan, you know, is a collection of islands that trail off to the south. And at the very end of the Ryukyu Islands, there was a sports diver by the name of Aratake. And in 1985, he was looking for a place where he could bring his diving teams, his scuba diving teams, recreational scuba diving, because the waters are very clear there. Yonaguni only has about 3,000 residents, and it's a real outback, not well known. And while he was scouting the waters around, looking for some nice place to go diving, he found this structure under the water. And it's off of a place called Iseki Point. And it is a natural outcropping of rock that has been terraformed, it's been sculpted into what is referred to in Japan as a citadel. And when he saw this structure, which struck him immediately as a man-made structure, he contacted Professor Masakai Kimura, who is one of the world's leading geologists. He's a world-class scholar at the University of the Ryukyus. He was commissioned by the Japanese government to do a thorough study of Iseki Point. Up until that time, Professor Kimura had no particular interest in underwater archaeology, and certainly had no interest in places called Mu or Lemuria. And after a 3-year survey of the Iseki Point monument with his classes, he concluded that it definitely is a man-made structure. He invited fellow geologists from around the world to come investigate. And some 15 geologists eventually joined him. Of those 15 geologists, they all concluded that it is a man-made structure, except two. A German who said no, it couldn't possibly be man-made because of its age. The age struck him as being so contradictory to everything that's known about the origins of civilization that he couldn't accept it. And it's that mainstream mentality which has been a tremendous barrier to understanding the past. There's a new video that's coming out. They don't even have a name for it yet, but I've got a chance to see it. And it's by the same people that did The Mysterious Origins of Man. It'll be out very shortly. And they interview this one mainstream archaeologist who is a really brilliant preacher. I won't mention his name, but it's on there anyway. And he is a highly educated, wonderful archaeologist, and he was being presented with the possibility of investigating a site in Mexico City, outside of Mexico City. And all of the data on this site outside Mexico City indicates that there was a campfire, a series of campfires being made by human beings far more than 250,000 years ago. Now, we're told that the earliest human beings arrived in North America between 12 and 15,000 years ago across a land bridge from Siberia. And here we have really incontrovertible evidence from geologists, and especially a gal by the name of Virginia Steen McIntyre, who is a professional, was called in for her expertise in carbon dating, or not carbon dating, but using all forms of dating burnt materials. And after a 14-year study, she and her team showed that this campfire site outside of Mexico City was at least 250,000 years ago. And now, since then, there's been far greater attention concentrated on this site by geologists who are telling us that it's 400,000 years old. It's a man-made site, 400. Not only a man-made site, but people could use fire at that time. Well, this archaeologist, when he was presented with this pile of data, not from fringe theorists, but from hard-wired scientists like himself, his quote, which is in this documentary, which you'll see, he says, "I don't care what kind of evidence you have, I can never accept those dates." You know, and what a shock, because he totally abrogated his status as a scientist. He's a worthless scholar. I don't care how many degrees or sheepskins this man has. Whatever he has to say is of no value. Can you imagine that his theory that the first human beings arrived here 12 or 15,000 years ago is more important than this 30 years of collected data from geologists and geneticists to indicate that this site is at least 250,000 years old? But no, we will not accept the evidence, no matter what the evidence says. He's quoting the site. I mean, he says it right on the table. And that's the same thing with this German geologist. He saw that and he says, it looks all very man-made, but it must be made by geological processes. So then he was challenged to say, well, okay, it's made by geological processes, then show us another site somewhere that looks similar to this. Well, there isn't any. Well, but it looks like a man-made site, but I can't accept it because we only say that human beings created the first civilization in the Near East 5,000 years ago. And you're talking about a site which is much older than that. And this site has been dated. And because this site has been dated, Namadol is also dated, even though it's totally different. Now, Yonaguni sits in 100 feet of water. And it sits on a kind of a platform. And they've not decided yet whether this is a man-made platform or a natural. The whole structure of Yonaguni is just a natural formation, to be sure, but it's been terraformed. It's been worked into grand staircases. It's been worked into at least 2 statues. One is of a turtle. Another one is the head of a man that looks very similar to the structures of Easter Island, although it's severely eroded by ocean currents over the years. There are fallen gateways. There's what is known as a road that goes around the structure. And some of the photographs here, I think, can illustrate that. Oh, God. Sorry, hold on. This is what is known as part of the theater. This is one of the stairways. All natural processes, you see, created this. Great terraces. Maybe, I don't know if you can see it with the light shining on it. Can we turn the light up and see? No? Just to give you some idea what it looks like. And the size of it is quite impressive. It's one of the... It's amazing about this gateway. It looks like something... If you had this on land and you showed this photograph to somebody, they'd say, well, this is obviously Andean stonework, you know, from Cusco area or something like that. The same setup there. And we'll get to that later on, I suppose. After that. Now, it sits in 100 feet of water. And so does Nan Madol. That's earliest standing columns. So how long ago was it that the oceans were 100 feet lower than they are now? And that was at the end of the last ice age. In other words, 12,000 years ago, when all of the seas were, not all the seas, but the seas were locked up into the great ice sheets, and until they began to melt, it's common knowledge now is that the oceans were much lower than they are now. So that means that this site is related to non-Madol and that they were both made at the same time. In other words, they were made before 10 to 12,000 years ago. And there is no escaping that date, that there was a high civilization that spread across the Pacific, and that even though this site is 2,300 miles away from non-Madol, they were both built at the same time. Not only that, but those glyphs that I mentioned at non-Madol, the square, the rectangle, the separated rectangle, and the cross also appear at Yonaguni. So there's evidence to show that the same culture bearers were at both places. If you were to, say, have the perspective of being in space, and then another perspective where you could see all the archaeological sites throughout the Pacific, you would see a form beginning to emerge. There are other sites like this throughout the Pacific that I don't have time to discuss, but they're wonderful. There's one place called Malden Island, which is the small island in the North Pacific. Something like almost 4,000 miles away from non-Madol. And on little Malden Island, very small, there is never any trace that anybody has ever lived there. There's nothing grows there, at least not today. But yet on Malden Island, there are a number of these platform mounds, small platform mounds, similar to what you see in North America. They're made out of shell and stone and beach rock. And on the one side of the island, on the north side of Malden, there's a staircase, a grand staircase. And it goes from the top of this flat little island and it marches into the sea. No one knows how far into the sea it went originally because a lot of it has just eroded away, but it goes down at least 20 feet below the surface of the Pacific. There are other sunken structures throughout the Pacific like this. Massive stonework. All of it different. Similar and different in the sense there's one island, of course we know about Easter Island itself. It's now understood about Easter Island that the dating on Easter Island is totally off. And thanks to a man by the name of Childress, David Hatcher Childress, who's very well known to many of you. He's a publisher in Kempton, Illinois, has written many books. He's the first one that questioned the dating on Easter Island, the great stones. The mainstream archaeologists will tell you that Easter Island was made, the stones were raised there only a couple or 300 or 400 years ago at most. That the earliest habitation of Easter Island goes back only to about 400 AD. But it was Childress, when he was at the visiting the great stone structures at Easter Island, noticed that there was lichen growing on many of these statues, and that lichen takes a very long time to grow. He also noticed that the lichen was in some of the cracks and the crevices and growing deeply into the stones. That takes a long time. It takes more than a few hundred years to grow. Now, lichen doesn't grow at a steady rate. If it did, then we'd be able to date these things. They surge in their growth, and the other weather conditions make them grow faster or slower. However, Dr. Schock, now that you're familiar with, who did the work of the Great Sphinx, has done a more serious study of the lichen at the University of Boston, and they are able to get some kind of a date growth going. And it indicates that the stones at Easter Island go back not a few centuries, but many thousands of years. They're actually much older than even Childress expected. And what is it about the great moai, those tremendous stone statues you see on Easter Island? They seem to be unique. There are these statues of men in which they have long tapering fingers, and they're over their navel. They're all standing like this, reproduce the same one. They're right over the navel, and the navel stone is prominent. The original name for Easter Island was Rapa Nui, and the even older name than that was Te Pitu Tehenawa in Polynesian. And Te Pitu Tehenawa means the navel of the world, and seems to be indicated by the navel set. And on the other side of the world, in Turkey, you have a place called Göbekli Tepe, which has now been dated back over 10,000 years ago, at the same time as this. Göbekli Tepe, a Neolithic city, incredible. And the structures you see there are also figures that have these long tapering fingers that go over the navel, and the prominence on the navel stone. How remarkable that in places so widely spread out, you see these same rather singular themes being indicated. And from that view in space, you would see the remains of an enormous civilization that's spread out all over the Pacific, that still mystifies archaeologists who don't even like talking about these things because they're very detrimental, they're very heretical when it comes to their mainstream theories. And the only conclusion that I've been able to draw, and I've tried to put it in my book, and I'm by no means the first that it's done this, is that not only was there once a great high civilization spread out all over the Pacific, and that these new testing technologies are enabling us to date it farther back than we ever imagined before, but that this civilization goes back so far before the beginnings of civilization in the Near East that it's almost completely removed from it. That this appears to be not only a very old civilization, but it appears to be the place where man made the crucial step from savagery to civilization. It is the first civilization. It is the first place where human beings finally organized society, where they ceased being something more than an ape-like animal and became something more than that. And what I've tried to do in my work, I've tried to peel back the layers further and further, and I am coming to the conclusion that there was a seminal event that took place in our history. And it's an important event because it's created exactly, it's gone into who and what you are as an individual, you individually, because of this event. And thank God, in a way, that we live in these times, because science has accelerated and brought out so much information now that I know that when I'm writing a book, for example, on this material that I've been gathering for so long, as I'm writing it, new information is coming in, which either is validating what I'm saying or else completely changing it or invalidating it. I have to keep pace with it. And the great discovery that has come out is about a thing that happened in Indonesia 75 to 80,000 years ago. Before 75 or 80,000 years ago, now because of all of the advances in human genetics, we know that the world population was 2 million. The human population was 2 million about 80,000 years ago. However, that population didn't look like you and me entirely. Yes, it's mostly Homo sapiens. There are also others that had survived, Neanderthals and so on. But we were not Homo sapiens sapiens that we are now. There's significant differences. We were kind of in an evolutionary cul-de-sac, an evolutionary merry-go-round. Variations of human beings came and went all the time. That's why they're finding new evolutionary trails that seem to go everywhere. And we haven't really achieved all that much, not that much to distinguish us from the other animals. And 80,000, 75,000 years ago was the largest volcanic eruption known in the Earth's history. It's called Mount Toba. And when Mount Toba exploded 75 to 80,000 years ago, more like 75,000 years ago now, it put so much material into the atmosphere, it utterly changed the atmosphere. Not only did it decimate Indonesia, but it changed world climate in a very radical way. It wiped out whole species. And our species was threatened with extinction. We came this close to checking out. And from 2 million human beings, our population shrunk to an estimated 2,000 mating pairs. That's low. And those survived only because they were the toughest, they were the smartest, the most resourceful. And over the generations, this elite, the surviving elite, became you and me. Our immune systems, our adaptability, everything that distinguishes the modern human being can be traced back to that event. Human beings got off of the evolutionary merry-go-round. We were no longer just a rather ugly and unproductive mammal and became something more. The challenge of Mount Toba wiped us all out. Talk about a holocaust. This was more than just in terms of numbers. It was a whole species that was on the brink of disappearance. But we came back. And it was that challenge where you begin to see changes almost immediately after by the survivors of Mount Toba. You see the beginnings of culture, the beginnings of art, really art, were thought to have begun much later in Western Europe. No, now the traces of the very beginnings of an artistic appreciation, necklaces being made, the first attempts at sculpture are now being found in the Southeast Asia area, which spread elsewhere. Primitive beginnings. And if you continue to trace those beginnings from about 75,000 years ago, it leads directly up into places like this. So human civilization does not go back 5,000 years ago to the Near East. Civilization goes back 75 to 80,000 years ago. And that this elite, the surviving elite that has created all of us, from which we are all directly descended, evolved this. Now, what happened in the Ice Age? What brought all this early civilization to an end? What happened? We know that the Ice Age, which had lasted for several 100,000 years, had shrunk the sea levels down. And then the grand melt began to take place. The glaciers began to retreat. The ocean's levels rose. All sounds rather calm. It's a slow, steady process that was believed to have taken place. That now is out. When an ice age begins and when it ends is a very dramatic and highly violent affair. And why do ice ages take place? What causes them? It's the Earth's relationship to the sun. The Earth, when it spins, has a rotational process and a pattern, and it oscillates. And when the northern hemisphere is inclined towards the sun, you have a climate like we have now. When the Earth begins to pull away on its axis and incline away, the direct rays of the sun now go south. When it pulls away, that means the ice sheets advance. There's been a perfect correlation that's now been found between these two relationships. So when the Earth began to advance incline towards the sun, that's when the melting took place. It's a violent affair. Tremendous floods take place. Extinctions take place. And this is what we think happened with this civilization, which is recalled very vaguely and dimly in the tribal memories of people like the natives of Punat. They call it Kamasweo. It's this great kingdom that went under the sea. In other parts of the world, they refer to it as Mu. The Romans called it Lemuria. That's where that term comes from. Interestingly enough, Lemuria, the specific civilization, that term originates in Rome. That's the earliest reference we have that. They had a festival. The earliest, the oldest known Roman festival was called the Lemuria. And it took place every March. And it was their equivalent of our Halloween, in which they believed that the ghosts of people that had died before their time or had died under violent circumstances came back every year at the end of March, and that you had to have a propitiatory ceremony called the Lemuria. And Lemuria was a place that they distinguished from Atlantis. The Romans regarded Atlantis as a far more recent affair in the Atlantic Ocean. They weren't particularly interested in that, although they had traditions of it. And Lemuria was of another place they didn't know where it was, somewhere far away in the ocean center. Not the same as Atlantis. And that also went under the sea long before Atlantis, they said. And part of the Lemuria festival included the head of the house who wore his ancestral clothes, or close to that, and he would walk barefoot through the house while everybody else was out of the house, and he had a little sack of beans, and he would go through each one of the rooms in the house and he'd sprinkle beans, rooms of the house. And every time he did that, he would say, in good spirits, out bad. Now, why would you do that? Why beans? Because the bean was regarded as symbolic of the human soul. And the beans that the Romans used, interestingly enough, reveal the pineal gland. Interesting. So make what conclusions you want from that. And on the other side of the world, in Japan, you have a ceremony called the Bon Odori. And the Bon Odori, which is held at different times of the year, but sometimes in spring, has the head of the household walking through alone in each house with a sack of beans, and he's saying, in good spirits, out bad. Same thing. Interesting enough. Same thing as in Lemuria. So we conclude that this civilization, which is called Mu or Lemuria, come on, Weso, the people that live in Easter Island referred to as Mare Renga, they're all cultural inflections on the name of the same place. That this was the very first place where human beings made that crucial step from savagery to civilization. There are other memories, cultural memories of this place. Keep hitting the wrong thing. Here we are in Thailand. This is called the Lac Muang, and it is the absolute center of Bangkok. And it is, you go into this beautiful little shrine, and it's a golden pillar. That's all it is. And people make donations to it of all kinds. And the story of the Lac Muang is that the ancestors of the Thai people were called the Thens, T-H-E-N-S. And the Thens came from a kingdom, a splendid kingdom in the Pacific Ocean. And that this splendid kingdom made incomparable donations to world culture. That's right. It happened a very long time ago. And that the seas began to rise, and their culture was being lost. And the Thens had to evacuate this sinking island. And so the only thing they did is they grabbed a column from one of their temples. And they took this column with them, which they referred to as the Lac Muang. And they brought it with them to Thailand and restarted civilization in Thailand. Their kingdom in Thailand was called Ayutthaya, and Ayutthaya was destroyed by their enemies many centuries later. This is not the original column. People would like to think, oh, this is a column from Mu or Lemuria. It's a replica, because the original was lost with the fall of Ayutthaya. The Thai reestablished themselves at a new capital called Bangkok, and they established that at the very center. So there are these traditions of the lost civilization. That's my thing there. Yonaguni again. Yeah, here's a place now in Peru. This is called Chanchan. And Chanchan is a huge city, a beautiful city, made before the Incas, not long before the Incas, a couple centuries before. And their traditions are that Chanchan was created, or their people began, after a great island in the Pacific Ocean began to sink. Same story on both sides of the world. And here on the sides of the wall, indicating their place of origin. This is a sunken city. These are fish swimming over the top of it, indicating that that's where they came from. So, what I said at the beginning about non-Madol being an indication of our future as well as of our past as a species is because civilizations are sometimes the victims of their own self-indulgence and ignorance, and sometimes they're a victim of natural forces, and sometimes a combination of both. And it's possible that we're facing the same sort of a dilemma. I wrote a book a couple of years ago. It's mostly outdated now, and I'm not trying to sell it. It's outdated because it dealt with the Maya calendar of 2012. And a lot of people were misconceptions about that the Maya were predicting the end of the world last December. Well, anybody that really investigated that found that that's absolute nonsense. But what the Maya did say, and it's almost as fantastic, people living over 2,000 years ago, the Maya did say that in 2012, the equivalent of our time, that there would be a major change
But they didn't say that it would take place specifically on December 21st, 2012. They used that as a kind of an analogy. They're saying that in our time, there would be a major change and there would be trouble with the sun. That's basically all that the Maya said. They said that a cycle would end. And that when the cycle ended, it would be the end of a world. Not of the earth, not of nature. Nature would not end, but human society would end. And they used that time of December 21st because that's the winter solstice. It was an analogy. It was not meant to be taken literally. The winter solstice is the shortest day of the year, the longest night. And night was equivalent, and is equivalent, with ignorance and fear. And so they're speaking in poetic terms. People who try to take every word of the Bible literally and apply it to historical events, it doesn't work. It turns out to be nonsense. But if you take the Bible and regard it as a poetic allegory, then it sings and great truths emerge. The writers of the Bible were the same as the people, the same mindset who make the Mayan calendar. They weren't interested in facts. They were interested in truths. Those are two totally different things. Facts can change. Truths are eternal. The writers of the Old and New Testament were the same as the creators of the Mayan calendar in that regard. Prophetically, ways we cannot even imagine, the Maya said that our time would be a time of great transition, the greatest of all. It would be literally the end of time for this civilization, just as it was for this past civilization. And the Maya did assign a moral aspect to it. They said that if human beings as a whole, if our species as a whole continues to sin against the laws of nature, the very forces that brought us into existence, that those forces would wipe us out. And that, but if we make an attempt to go in the right direction, they say, then we can avoid the destruction. So it's a moral thing. But it's interesting that ice ages are brought about by trouble with the sun, just exactly as the Maya were saying. In the planet's declination to the sun indicates whether or not we have an ice age. Well, are we in an ice age now? Are we being threatened with one? It would seem so this particular winter. But we are due for an ice age. As a matter of fact, we are overdue for an ice age. The last ice age that we had was only 12,000 years ago. If you go on the internet, as I did, and you just go for mainstream geological opinion on the ice age, you will see that we are due for one. We're actually overdue for one. And when ice ages begin, they begin with the same type of patterns that we're experiencing today. Not global warming. Global warming is only a factor in this. It's climate deterioration, climate instability. I've traveled around the world several times, as some of you have. And wherever you go, people are saying the weather is crazier now than it has ever been before. Everywhere you go. Some blame it all on pollution and man. Others say it's an entirely natural affair. No one really knows that. There are probably factors on both that. But nonetheless, things are changing. So I conclude that we are going through the very early stages of another, what is referred to as a glacial epoch. Geologists don't like to refer to them as ice ages, but as glacial epochs. And I think that the declination, the relationship to the sun is happening. So I think that our generation and the generations coming immediately after us are going to be severely challenged. And how much man plays a role in this, we don't know. We can't even stop it if it's a natural phenomenon. But it's happened before. And I think that the civilization, that man reached very high levels of sophisticated, organized society long ago. And the places like Yonaguni and Namdodol indicate that. So I know that people want to speak here, but I will stop here. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them for you. No? Okay. Well, I'll make a space then for someone else. Thank you very much.